All right, we're live. Welcome, good afternoon, on behalf of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I guess that's our go alarm there. I'm Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow here at the Institute. Thank you for joining us for this 7th public event of our global competition project titled Energy Advantage, the Cornerstone of 21st Century Security and Prosperity. Today we're going to discuss U.S. public and private energy the U.S. public and private energy sectors to illuminate the strengths, vulnerabilities, and opportunities in related technologies, resources, infrastructure, and policy and security as they pertain to fostering enduring competitive advantages for the U.S. on the world stage. What will help us assure our future security, prosperity, and high quality of life when it comes to energy policy, resource allocation, research and development investments by business and government, and our international relationships. The exceptionally high quality of life most Americans are accustomed to, along with those of many of our partners and our allies, is the product of global interdependencies. Balanced reciprocal relationships, both economic and others, with other nations, to include a shared reliance on common energy markets. With that comes a complex set of implications, most recently brought to the light by the war in Ukraine, and most notably in the deterrent stranglehold Russian oil and gas has on European and other global markets. Taking this into account, should the U.S. move to rebalance its energy portfolio? If so, what should that new balance look like? Should the U.S. further leverage its wealth of existing oil deposits and refining capabilities while pushing related research and development to the edge, or seek energy independence elsewhere? Is energy independence even a realistic policy goal for that matter, given the current domestic political environment? If so, how does that factor into economic inequalities and our overall societal stability? Given America's complex role as an energy supplier and consumer on the world stage, how do we best navigate the sometimes tenuous interdependence between energy markets and the broader global economy to maintain a competitive advantage? The answers to these questions are not independent, and bad actors further complicate the calculus, of course. U.S. energy infrastructure is constantly targeted to that end. The recent highly publicized cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline is just one notable among countless attacks occurring daily. Remembering Iraq's attack on Kuwait in 1991, allies and partners have been coerced and even attacked based on energy-driven motives. Questionable political, economic, and humanitarian situations in energy-rich nations like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia have impeded U.S. approaches to energy policy and commerce, especially when they're inconsistent with our morals and values. How should the U.S. leverage its strengths and resources in the energy sector without compromising its soul to assure a prosperous, secure future? If the U.S. expects to keep a sustained leg up on competitors as the world's second largest producer of consumer of energy, pursuit and employment of state-of-the-art technologies and practices is an imperative. Continued development and adoption of advanced energy capabilities for commercial and government use will not only improve daily life, but can help hedge against ails of climate change, mitigate risks to life, and potentially enhance social stability and the economy. So how do we balance pursuits of sustainable energy practices and renewable energy technologies while also assuring security and prosperity? For the U.S. to remain a leader in an arena as broad and potentially as volatile as the energy sector will require a multi-pronged societal level effort. Such is especially challenging given modern-day demands for consistent, proliferated access to energy and the aforementioned interdependencies across global markets. Ultimately, today's discussion is focused on which opportunities to pursue while highlighting the vulnerabilities we need to mitigate. What is the right mix of policy and and public and private investment to ensure the U.S. remains a competitive leader when it comes to energy on the world stage. What should our energy future look like? But before we get to that discussion today, I'd like to offer the floor to the chairman of...
No, let's make that real quick. Let's get going. You're doing fine.
All right, we will forego that.
Now we're already 5 minutes ahead of time.
Thank you, sir. And without further ado, then I'll go ahead and introduce the Global Competition Project just in general, to give those of you that haven't had a chance to join us previously just a little bit of a background of why we're here, what the focus of the project is. So, and after that, we'll do our introduction. So a little bit about the Global Competition Project. The project was launched to explore what the United States must do to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise, driving toward a societal level understanding and approach to competition at the intersection of policy, industry, and science and technology. To do so, the project is commissioning a spectrum of experts, which we have today, from diverse fields across the Potomac Institute's network. Their purpose is to highlight and elevate issues surrounding both the challenges and the opportunities associated with societal level competition for today and in the future. What are the greatest vulnerabilities, again, to consider? What's at stake? How do we best leverage our strengths? Ultimately, the project's goal is to develop foundational references through research, discussions like we're having today, events and papers, etc., for national security professionals, policymakers, industry leaders, and others as they drive awareness and understanding in how the U.S. might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. So, that said, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our distinguished panel. And first, to my left, we have Mr. Frank Fannon, who's the Managing Director of Fannon Global Advisors, a firm focused on geopolitics, energy transition, and market transformation. He was the first Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, advising on issues where energy served as a proxy for broader foreign policy issues, which we're going to, I think, talk a lot about today. Prior to the State Department, Mr. Fannon was Managing Director for BHP U.S. Corporate Affairs. He led government affairs for Murphy Oil Corporation and also served as counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and also was counsel to 2 U.S. senators. Also joining us virtually today is Mr. Ron Nussle Jr., the President and Chief Operating Officer of New Hope Energy, which is a renewable plastics, fuel, and energy producer. Ron previously served as Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Management and was President and founder of ICR Lean Supply, LLC. He's also authored a book called Integrated Cost Reduction, published in 2004 by Reed Press. Ron is a board member of a NASDAQ company. He was also a managing director at Lam Research Corporation and director of strategic supply chain management for Cessna Aircraft Company, in addition to 12 years spent at Honeywell Aerospace in engineering operations, M&A, and program management. To my right, we have Ms. Gentry Lane, who is the CEO and founder of ANOVA Intelligence, a cyber national security software company that serves American critical infrastructure companies. She's an appointee to the NATO Science and Technology Organization panel on the cyber defense of military systems. She's also a fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and is a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. She advises members of Congress, NATO, and U.S. defense and intelligence leaders, and is a scholar of military strategy. As mentioned, the discussion today and perspective provided by our panelists will be captured in a paper or a series of papers. Which will complement the project's overall mission. The goal is for those papers that also came from the other events and discussions that we've been able to have, along with the substance of today's event, to be drawn on, again, as a reference for policymakers, industry leaders, and others, and how the country might address the most consequential aspects of societal level competition in the future. So all that said, I'm going to take a break from talking because I've been talking way too much, and I'm going to turn it over to Frank here for his opening remarks. And what we're going to do is we'll have him talk to for 7-10 minutes and move around the panel. Each of us will do that, and then we'll start it to some Q&A. So over to you, sir.
Great, thank you. Great to be with you all. Thank you. Yeah, I think the name of this as a cornerstone of prosperity, energy as. I think it's exactly the right thinking, because energy, we talk about it, but it's more than BTUs or barrels. It's really the engine of economies and progress, whether it's the fuel in the tanks that are roaring right now or on our cell phones. It's absolutely underpins life. As you mentioned, when I was at the State Department, we looked at energy as a proxy for other foreign policy issues. And we saw energy, the State Department is not a technical agency by any means, but what we can do is bring to bear the entirety of the whole of government approach, where energy is pretty material. And it was also coincided at a point in history where the United States became the largest oil and gas producer in the world. We had our first shipment of LNG in 2016. And 3 years later, a little less than that, we were the third largest producer or exporter in the world, and now we're poised to be number one. So it's amazing what can happen if industry is given the opportunities to get after it and innovate and create unique business models that never occurred before. And an industry that was, up until the U.S. entry, was reasonably well defined. It also gives foreign policy latitude to do all manner of other things. The U.S. became the largest oil producer in the world, eventually producing upwards of 13 million barrels. This gave significant optionality for U.S. to engage in other areas of security where otherwise the U.S. successive U.S. governments were unwilling to do. In particular, to have a stronger position on Iran. You mentioned Venezuela, also Russia, as well as the DPRK. So U.S. through our own production. Of course, the U.S. government thankfully doesn't control the energy market, the U.S. producers. But what we did have an understanding is how market participants would respond to appropriate policy and policy-induced market conditions, and respond they did. We had our policy taking more than 3 million barrels of oil off the global market, but we did it in cooperation with Gulf-producing states, in partnership with them, as well as with that reasonable expectation of how U.S. producers would respond. And it created a degree of optionality for us to intervene. Now, whether one wants to say that was right or wrong, the file that I was managing, it was effective. The Economist magazine, other public media were predicting, the world was going to end if we were going to proceed with our sanctions policy, but it didn't and had no impact on price at all. So energy, traditionally has been a source of conflict. I've just described it as a source of force projection, but it can also be a means to facilitate cooperation amongst states. I spent a lot of time in the Eastern Mediterranean region, where U.S. companies developed new gas resources that otherwise were undiscovered. But what we saw is the discovery of gas offshore Israel, a relatively small population, small demand center. The cost of that bringing that to market and scaling that up couldn't go just to Israel. Well, Israel lives in a pretty tough neighborhood. What we worked on was to facilitate a regionalization approach so that gas could shift around to other countries. We created a virtual pipeline through shipping gas from Israel to Egypt with LNG export infrastructure, at the same time developing new LNG import facilities in Greece, and then connectivity through the Balkans for gas pipelines. This creates, and so what happened through these new energy trading relationships is a halo effect that led into other types of political stabilization, other commercial opportunities, as well as security cooperation. So again, energy as a means, a path to greater collaboration among states. Of course, energy is also something that can be fought over, and we worked a considerable amount of time with respect to how China is using its course of policies to deny countries the ability to develop their own indigenous resources offshore, in particular Philippines and Vietnam, countries that energy demand growth are year-on-year double digits. There's a lot of talk about energy transition. Well, we should get off of oil because that will reduce our dependency and it'll improve our security position, as well as the climate benefit of doing so. I think the whole issue of, we've had multiple energy transitions throughout history. Those energy transitions typically were technology induced. You'd have a technology would be developed, the technology would be improved upon, the market would accept it, the public would accept it, and then there would be a regulatory framework around which it would be governed. This is different, the current transition we're talking about. This is a policy induced energy transition. And by all accounts, the technologies to achieve the ultimate end game in terms of reduction of carbon emissions, those technologies haven't been developed yet. So we're at a bit of a strange place. Second, whereas I said the U.S. was in a position of strength regarding our own energy abundance, we're seeking to transition to technologies and supply chains in which we are insecure. From the steps of, I wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times, was published last December. From the steps of Glasgow, President Biden called on OPEC to increase oil production. OPEC is an organization, multi-countries, representing 40% of global oil production. But we're seeking to transition under status quo to a technology supply chain for clean energy technologies on which we're reliant on China. 50 to 90% reliance on China, depending on the type of commodity and processing. I'm very concerned about this. If we were to look at present day, it's kind of like Germany's position on relying on Russia as a reliable supplier for gas. It's not a good thing to do. I'm not suggesting we don't proceed with the energy transition. I'm suggesting that we elevate our level of political will in this country so that the United States can reassert its leadership and control the commanding heights of the new economy. I think that we have to do that in far larger ways than we've done so thus far. We have to address the permitting issues. A mine takes 17 years to go from discovery to production. And as we continue to escalate climate ambition targets, we're not having a corresponding supply side response. And I think that's absolutely imperative for our country and our security going forward. I'll pause there. I don't know how that was on time, but.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. And we'll move to the virtual side of things where Ron is waiting to provide his perspective and remarks. You're on, sir.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Frank. Articulate as always. You're always a tough act to follow. So I need a crutch like the general does. So I'm going to put some slides up to try to make it a fair competition. So I wanted to really kind of bring up just 2 points. I'm going to use about 5 slides for each of the points. The first one is having a US-based, and this is an important point, financially viable and proven technology. Frank talked about that the previous energy transitions have been technology driven, whereas today's is policy driven, but you can have your cake and eat it too. There are financially viable technologies. I'm going to give you just one example, which is a solution to the global plastics problem. And the second one is I want to talk to you a little bit about my favorite subject and kind of where Frank and I became friends, is talking about the supply chain side. Just to kind of give you a quick background on myself. I spent a large portion of my career as an executive in supply chain management, first off in aerospace, then in the semiconductor industry. I ended up writing a book about it. So people tell me I know something, and I think it's true. I've managed a lot of businesses, multi-billion-dollar global supply chains for, again, multiple different families. And I also had the privilege of spending 2 years working for Secretary Pompeo. Originally, I was tasked with helping to accelerate embassy construction using some capabilities that we had developed over the years of modular design and construction, which is kind of a much more sustainable and faster way of developing buildings. And then I got involved once COVID hit on doing some repatriation and threat assessments of the semiconductor supply chain, which ended up ultimately becoming the very successful CHIPS Act to repatriate foundries back into America. Since I left the building, HST building, and at the transition of the new administration, I've been the president of New Hope Energy. And so now I'm learning a lot about some things I didn't even understand before. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about the global plastics problem and the solution that we've developed and how that fits in with the energy transition. We've all seen the pictures of sea turtles getting, plastic straws taken out of their noses, et cetera. There's 1 million tons of plastic a day generated and dumped in landfills. Where I live in Dallas, Fort Worth, 6,000 tons per day, every single day. So the founder of New Hope Energy developed a technology which is patented, and we're in the process of building a 1,000-ton per day plant. But just to kind of show you how the energy transition works and the complexity of doing that, we would need 6 of those plants at a cost of almost $500 million each just to solve the plastics problem in Dallas. So that would be about 300 plants to solve it in the United States. Each of those plants would generate about 2.5 million barrels of oil per year once they're in full operation. But just some quick facts on the plastics problem. Again, we've all heard about it. I've learned a lot more about the big plastics island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, what doesn't get a lot of press is that most of that comes down the 3 rivers of China, which is an unfortunate fact of the matter. And so how do we get rid of that? What are some of those solutions? There's recycling. Everyone talks about recycling. I used to live in California. We had 6 or 7 different bins that we had to recycle into. Unfortunately, after you put those in all the bins, about 91% of it ends up in landfills. In Europe, it's not much better, even though they're more aggressive at it. Only about 15% of it is landfill, but 70% of it is incinerated. So basically about the same percentages, about 80 or 90% is not actually recycled. About 9% in the US is recycled and about 15% in Europe, and partly because they have some exorbitant taxes, almost $1,000 per metric ton fees for dumping garbage into landfills. So everyone knows about all the ESG motivations. CEOs all over the world are aggressively setting aggressive targets. And as Frank and I have talked about a number of times, a lot of these energy transition goals are founded on goals and without clear strategies of how to achieve those. So one solution that I happen to be involved in now is recycling. There's 2 kinds. There's chemical and mechanical. Mechanical, which has been around a lot longer, actually has some severe limitations to it. It doesn't remove colorants. You can't reach food grade quality. You can only do it once or maybe twice. Most of the materials that we use have multiple layers, as many as 10 or even 15 for various things, and it doesn't work well for that. Chemical recycling removes colorants. You can get to food grade. The monomers created can go right back into virgin materials, and we can handle any sort of mixed plastics. So the process that we're using is a multi-step process called pyrolysis, which has been around for about 50 years, but nobody's been able to really make it commercially viable. And so at the end of the process, there's 2 things you can do with that. You can turn it back into plastic, which makes it a circular economy, or it can go into fuels, which becomes part of the energy transition. So that's what I'll talk about next, is as we're trying to expand this process to industrial scale and then ultimately to global scale to actually fix the energy transition or be part of the energy transition, it all comes down to infrastructure. And again, Frank and I have had these discussions in the past. The energy transition will require massive amounts of additional extraction for all the lithium and all the other materials that are part of the energy transition. So how do you scale the infrastructure? In our case, I just want to show you our example. We started out with a technology demonstrator about 10 years ago. That was successful. We have a pilot plant that's been successful. We're in the process of scaling that up 10 to 20 times to industrial scale. But again, you still haven't solved the problem I talked about earlier. We would need 30 of these plants just to solve the plastics problem in Texas alone. So that would be a regional scale. So now you're talking 100x. But again, that's only Texas. That's not even the United States, and certainly not globally. So you start talking about 1,000 times scale. So how do you scale these technologies in the current environment? And there's some very extreme challenges that we're working through, and all of our peers are working as well. So here's an example. Here's a pilot plant. As I said, this has been operating for a number of years. It's successful. It generates revenue. It's got customers signed up for 10-year contracts. All the big oil and gas companies that have aggressive ESG goals have signed multi-year contracts with us. Some name brands like Dow and CP Chem, ConocoPhillips, et cetera. And this is what everyone loves to see. This is garbage. It's not. It's actually plastic. It's clean plastic. It's already been baled up and it's been sorted. And this is what we put into our facility. And we have a giant warehouse full of this stuff, and we have trucks bringing it in all the time. And we're sorting it, chopping it up, and then putting it into our processing plants. So as we're trying to scale up, the technology is proven, yet the infrastructure expansion to go from pilot scale to industrial scale is essential to solve a global or US scale problem. So, unfortunately right now, the world is kind of distracted with Ukraine, and a lot of these other issues aren't really being addressed like they should have. These are challenges to getting global scale solutions to the energy transition. I'm just going to talk to you about 3 of them, kind of leveraging my background as a supply chain guy. First one is the Asia-based supply chain challenges, which Frank alluded to. Second one is this word nobody likes to talk about, hyperinflation. Fortunately, I'm here to tell you it's already arrived, at least in raw materials, equipment, and component prices. We're seeing it every single day, and all the other companies are as well that are building infrastructure in today's environment. It's absolutely hyperinflation. I can give you some examples of that. The third thing is lead times. Lead times have doubled and tripled for materials, equipment, and components, which means that all of these aggressive goals, we're going to get carbon neutral by 2025 or 2050, all of those require building out infrastructure. All of that infrastructure is now doubling and tripling in time to get that infrastructure built. So these are just 3 small examples. A much better example is something I was part of in July 2021. Office of Secretary of Defense, Critical Supply Chain Task Force, and you can look that up on the internet and talk about some other threat assessment activities. Global supply chain challenges. This is hot off the press just in the last week. This is ships stuck off the shore in Shanghai because of the recent COVID issues that they're dealing with and the lockdowns. So it's not just Port of Long Beach. This is inbound to Shanghai, which means they're not going to be able to be shipping products outbound. So we're about ready to see this coming very soon. The supply chain challenges are not getting better. They're going to get worse in the near term. Hyperinflation. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is in the last 9 or 12 months, where construction, which is where you have to build infrastructure with, has gone up 17%. This is obviously an average of everything going on in the industry. Peers of mine are seeing 50 to 100 to 200% increases in cost of raw materials. So again, hyperinflation. So how do you deal with that when you're trying to build out this infrastructure for the energy transition? And then the last thing, and then this is kind of the end of my talk, is talking about lead times. They're increasing by 50%. The Institute in Supply Management, which is the world's preeminent body that studies supply chain, they put out their global PMI report, which drives the market every month. In June of last year, they said that the lead times had reached all-time highs, records going back to 1987, and it just kept getting worse from July 21, September 21, and then March in 22. What's happening right now, and this is my last point, as we're in the process of expansion, we are absolutely seeing suppliers that they are making quotations. It's not just us, all the peers in the energy transition that I've talked to. The very next day, the suppliers are raising their prices 20 or 30% and increasing their lead times. So these are some of the challenges for the energy transition. I wanted to give you kind of a look from the boots on the ground. Frank kind of gave you the high level 60,000 foot version. I'm giving you more of the 5 or 10,000 foot version of what it's like to be a company trying to build out infrastructure and succeed in the energy transition with these headwinds. So that's the end of my discussion, and I look forward to talking in a few minutes.
Thanks, Ron. That's great material for lots of questions ahead. And now we're going to turn it over to Gentry for a few minutes here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, are you all ready to get dark? Well, my area of expertise, of course, is conflict in the cyber domain, and I think I'd like to start by talking about the why, because there are some general misconceptions about why. We all know that the grid or all energy supply, Colonial Pipeline was super high profile, so we know that our energy infrastructure is highly targeted. That's 100% accurate, 100% true. Russia, China have implants everywhere. So the question is, could they turn out the grid? Could they cripple our energy supply in a bigger way? Yep, they could. But just because they can doesn't mean they will. So I call this a high impact, low probability issue. They're unlikely. Adversaries are unlikely, and such as Russia. Like, there's a major threat actors, and then there's about another 80, 100 APTs, advanced persistent threats, that are behind them. Their strategy isn't actually to launch a catastrophic attack to knock America back to the dark ages via cyber effects. If somebody wanted to do that, it would be much more easier to launch an EMP. Cyber effects are temporary. They're really hard to pull off, number one, and hard to pull off at scale, or nearly impossible to pull off at scale. So why do the adversaries spend so much time focusing on energy? It's because it's a great way to weaken America, and it's a salami slicing tactic to launch a persistent, perpetual, almost imperceptible, gradual degradation of critical infrastructure, the energy sector, and all of them, really. So energy, financial, telecom, healthcare, transport, there's 16 different things. To weaken and compromise these systems, because in a weakened or distracted state, America can't fight back, or we may be unwilling or unable to engage in other activities. And we see that now. The internet's been around for 20-something, 25 years, essentially. It's only been in the last 15 that cyber conflict has been a thing. And it's not because people just figured out how. The technology you use to effectuate cyber effects is the same that we used 20 years ago. It's just our adversaries have figured out the optimal use, and they launch these persistent attacks, aggression on counter-value targets. And that's what right now what we would consider energy, or civilian, private investor-owned energy, a counter-value target. The question is, I don't know if we want to talk about this now, is what to do about it, because there's the way the government deals with it is by creating, from a policy point of view. But this is a war. This is an armed conflict. You don't use policy to solve armed conflict. You need to talk about it and use use all the dime instruments of power, but military power first and foremost, which means we need a strategy. The first step in a strategy is to define the current condition. Everybody, and the government and the civilian sector, no one's on the same page as to what's going on. Is this terrorism? Is it crime? Is it state-on-state aggression, armed conflict? We need to decide on a cohesive strategy that will work with both civilian and government sectors, because, again, the way we're going at it now is this sort of triage, reactive whack-a-mole approach. And that only serves the adversaries, because while we're distracted putting out this fire, they can go set 5 more. They're winning. Why don't I just stop there?
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Well, so I want to actually expand on what you just said here, and actually ask you a question, actually all of you a question, but you mentioned something about your work at state. You had an opportunity because of where state sits to bring a whole of government approach to dealing with some of the challenges that we have. Did that work out? What were the challenges? So, we're trying to figure out what we need to do as a country, right, to maintain our leadership, maintain some competitive advantage. And one of the things that we've talked here consistently about is that ability to have that whole societal approach, whole of government. What's your experience here? What were the challenges? What do we need to address? What scared the heck out of you that we need to tackle and move forward on that front?
Yeah, it's a critically important point, and I've spoken publicly about this. One of my just my own experience, if you're sitting in the Situation Room and you're going around the alphabet soup, everyone's approaching can look at the same issue, the same problem set, but from completely different lenses, from their own perspective, and they're seeking to advance their own equity because that's the position from which they see the world. You have to have a single point of accountability that can differentiate those good intentions, but to achieve the outcome along the lines of the time horizon that's been stipulated by whomever. In my case, it was the time horizon stipulated by Secretary Pompeo, and I was very grateful to have a very strong collaborative relationship with the Secretary, and that was, I think, reasonably well known, and he had obviously had a strong relationship with the President. So it was a bit of understanding and awareness that, firstly you have to go to these meetings and these interagency discussions with that everyone's trying to do the right thing from the way they sit, and their intentions are genuine. But sometimes that kind of interagency, the way it plays out really is there won't be an agreement, and then who's running the DC, the meeting will say, okay, well, these two agencies need to go back and we'll come back and talk to us in 2 weeks and see if you reconcile the difference. And then you go in this perpetual 2-week cycle of going back and not figuring things out. So how do you have it? And so you have effectively an analysis paralysis problem, and you're not advancing the mission. So having a single point of accountability, whether that's a designated, making that clarity, because frankly, if everyone is in charge, no one is, and so having Secretary Pompeo assert, he's the first sitting Secretary of State to go to CERAWeek, which is the international, the energy conference of the world. It's held in Houston. It was just held last month. He's the first sitting Secretary of State to talk about this, to talk about these issues. So he understood it, and then we bring the whole of government along the ride to achieve the foreign policy objective, and we delegate those other areas to the agencies that have the stronger technical competency. So is that Treasury in one respect? Is it DOE in another respect? Is it the Development Finance Corporation to mobilize capital? But that was it's been one of my criticisms of the current administration. They've elevated this energy transition and the recognition that we need to address our clean energy supply chain, but there isn't a single person in charge. And going back to I've researched this back to the times of FDR, the proliferation of special envoys and what have you. So and this administration has lots of them too. So they need to designate that to reconcile these equities, or else we're never going to achieve we're never going to get across the goal line.
All right. So, Ron, what was your experience in the State Department on this front? I mean, where you sit is where you stand is obviously a theme that came across pretty strongly here and is understandable. But what say you, sir, on that front?
I was, thanks, Tim. I actually had a follow-up to that. So again, we were there at the same time. When COVID hit, there was an understanding that some of these supply chains, these critical supply chains, and there were 4 or 5 of them that were mentioned: pharmaceutical, semiconductor, rare earth, automotive, and we started seeing actions which at first we thought were just collateral damage from the global pandemic breaking down supply chains. But then we started seeing that there appeared to be more active involvement from bad actors in disturbing some of those supply chains. And so, kind of as Gentry talked about, is it cyber? Is it terrorist? Is it country on country? We started seeing that it was some of all the above, but some of the last as well. So I was leading or co-leading the semiconductor supply chain analysis that was going on. And as Frank said, it was an interagency task force. We met together multiple times. We did a whole from end to end threat assessment. There's somebody that's participating in the call today that was part of that. And that went on for a number of months between the SecDef, Office of Secretary of Defense, that was involved in that. We also had commerce. I was there representing state, somebody else from actually multiple areas. We had both E and M within state. I was in M. We had E, Keith Kroc, Undersecretary Kroc, Nobel laureate now, happy to say. But we also had the Vice President's office. We had multiple different, and we were all meeting together, and there was a clear accountability and a clear objective. We put together a strategy. We did an end-to-end threat assessment of the economic and national security impacts of the semiconductor supply chain. Because of my background working for 10 years as a C-level executive in semiconductor, I was instrumental in putting that together. Again, thinking about what's going on the ground. We put it together, we identified the threats, we identified solutions, and then we put forth legislation, which got passed. And the amazing thing was, some of these things, everyone says left versus right. It was 96-0 or 96-4 actually voted on in the Senate. You don't get any more bipartisan than that. Ironically, the 4 people that voted against it were Republicans, and it was a Republican administration. So it just shows you can have things that are bipartisan, and you pull everyone together. The CHIPS Act was passed. We were able to put together some incentive packages to balance the scale between some of the overseas NAT funding that was going on. Those of you that don't know, building a semiconductor plant, we all say it's a critical part of our infrastructure because the entire information economy, I compare that to ball bearings during World War II. Whenever you'd see these old movies, they're always bombing ball bearing factories. Why was that? Because everything ran on ball bearings, trucks and tanks and planes and ships. Without ball bearings, you shut down the enemy. Well, in today's information technology economy, semiconductors are the ball bearings of the information economy. And so we saw that, and these other governments were funding these 15 to 20 billion with a B dollar plants. And there was a 40% gap in cost between building overseas and building here. So we decided as a government to close that gap, and TSMC, which put together a plant in Phoenix, Arizona, and using some of that funding. We've also now got Samsung here in Texas building another plant. And so we're bringing back domestic manufacturing of a critical technology that we used to own because we really invented it in the US. So again, I can't highlight what Frank said better. Having that whole of government, having single point authority, having a clear mission and a clear objective was very, very successful. And it's working even today. And that was put together in a very short time, in about 9 months or 8 months, from initiation through legislation, through implementation, through funding for the implementation of it.
Outstanding. And so actually, I'm going to reach over here to Gentry and ask. So based on this experience that has been expressed, you're calling for a strategy at a higher level to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. Who should lead? I mean, that strategy at the end. Who should be accountable at the end of the day? Is it the president? Is it one of the different departments? Is it? I mean, where does that? Is it Department of Energy? Is that where it lands?
So, which strategy? So, your comments, Frank, about the conflicting stakeholders and having good intentions. What's that saying about the road to hell is paved with good intentions? It is a big problem. Everyone wants to own a piece of the problem for their own ego glory of all those dudes sitting around that table, and also to increase their own budgets. So that's somehow has to be removed from the equation. And so what are we asking? What is the end goal? So if we're talking about what is our global competition strategy, that's a State Department thing. But if we're talking about our cyber conflict strategy, that is not a State Department thing, that's a DoD thing. And my whole point is it's not one strategy. We need a strategy to counter, a counter response strategy, a strategy to get us back up to zero, and then a strategy to get us above and beyond, because we're sort of underwater right now. We're sort of like we're behind. So it's a different departments, different things. But for now, it seems like last administration, this administration, even worse, the administration before, there's a lot of birds fighting over that French fry.
Yeah, when it comes to the clean energy supply chain, I would say you'd have to divide it up between U.S. domestic and international. There is already an agency, it's the longest serving one in our government, dealing with the International State Department, and they have a good mechanisms to bring the entirety of the whole of government behind them. So I think in the international side, there's already some initiatives. Actually, I created some initiatives around good governance and mining and responsible sourcing that the Biden administration has continued. It continues to be, and they're seeking to expand it, which I think is a great idea. The domestic side, I think, is where we have the greater challenges. And I think, because you could do a mining project or a processing plant, you could have 4 or 5 different federal agencies implicated. And so I think someone in the White House needs to take that over. And it has to be someone, I would propose someone who has considerable private sector experience, having run complex organizations, someone who has political heft, who can arbitrate those equities within the interagency, and someone who has the president's ear, so that there's clarity amongst the other respective principals that this is a priority and we need to get something done here.
All right. Well, we have some folks online that are a lot of folks apparently that are joining us, and I wanted to give an opportunity for Dr. Locklear to provide one of those questions that we've been asked, if that's possible. Please, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Welter. We do have a question from Dr. Claire Carity. Should the USG pick market winners and losers with respect to improving our energy portfolio? And how would we measure that impact or success?
Anyone want to take a stab at that initially? I mean, I'm going to throw it over to Ron first. Given where you're sitting, sir, in the middle of industry and at the head of a company, what do you think about that?
Well, of course, the obvious answer should be no. However, that's not the way our competition overseas does this. In the example that I mentioned earlier, there was actually quite a bit of angst because we do have one of the top 3 semiconductor companies in the world whose initial starts with I and last letter is L. And why didn't they get the initial funding? And so what we did is we set up a fund that could work across multiple different companies, and we said the entire supply chain can get access to it. However, we did do a threat assessment, and what we found is that our goal was to establish the preeminent who actually had the market leadership in the world, and it was hands down. Everybody knew that TSMC actually had the leading edge technology in terms of the next node technology node, and they were ahead, unfortunately, of our domestic. In fact, even Intel acknowledged this. So if the goal, back to Gentry's question, if the goal was to establish leading edge technology, a fab for 5 nanometers, 4 nanometers in the US, there was really only one company to pick. So TSMC got the nod. Samsung was right behind them. They also got some money. And now Intel, new CEO, Pat Gelson, somebody who I happen to know, is also getting money. So it doesn't have to be a winner and loser, but there can be a prioritization. And just because I'm on that, I actually, if you don't mind, maybe can answer the second question, because I'm going to have to drop off in about 4 minutes. Somebody asked about what's the time between plan and pulling out manufacturing for silicon. It's about 3 years. So to build a leading edge fab is a 3-year plus process. So and that's, it really can be 4 in some cases. They're doing things like I talked about, modular construction and modular design to accelerate that, but it's about a 3-year process. So from the time if you think about it, it took us 9 months from setting the goal to establishing the legislation, to implementing the legislation and writing the check, which was basically from March of 2020 to January of 2021. It's about 3 years from there before chips start rolling out the end of the fab and actually impacting the supply chain. So these are, unfortunately, these are things that transition across political cycles, 4 years or 2 years or 6 years in the case of the Senate. So we have to have what our competitors have. These other countries, they don't think like we think. They think about, it's a 5-year plan or a 7-year plan or a 10-year plan. And you have to have a multi-year plan to execute these long-term technologies. So I covered 2 questions at once, Tim. Sorry about that.
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
And Ron's point about the work he did and the CHIPS Act and the time that, from identification of the problem to solution and getting something passed that's historic. I mean, it's really, I really think is perhaps without precedent. We tend to focus on the losses. We don't seem to celebrate the wins, and this certainly is one that could be. I'd love to see it, done repeatedly, but we'll see. In terms of picking winners and losers, I agree with Ron's initial sentiment. The answer should be no. What we should do is create the conditions for innovation and appropriate competition. Government, I wrote the hydraulic fracturing provisions that were included in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. That provision was not government directing industry to produce oil through hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling. It was the government, the federal Congress, restricting the ability of the EPA from regulating hydraulic fracturing when it was in its relative infancy, because it was being regulated by the states. It was actually an area of Congress acting wisely and saying that they saw something happening in the shale patch, and innovation was occurring. And we should promote that innovation. And so the EPA should step away from that and let it continue to be regulated in the states. 3 years later, the shale revolution was born, and then I mentioned we used oil and gas and America's oil and gas abundance for our foreign policy objectives. Create the conditions for innovation, let the private sector get after it, do it in an appropriate way. And doing it in an appropriate way is one of what's not happening in terms of by the scale of the clean energy transition. Most of the mining and processing and manufacturing, or a considerable amount of manufacturing, is done in ways that are violative of Western values. And they are done in a way that's completely opaque. Oil and gas. Oil is the most fungible, transparent commodity traded on the planet. Where stuff comes from. It's easily trackable, and it's tracked all the time. You don't know what's in your Tesla, where things came from. And to suggest that we're in a competition with China, I think, is false. We're playing completely different games. We're ascribing a certain set of values to the way in which we do our things, and they don't. So one of my proposals has been, how do we approach this in a way, and it's not picking winners and losers, it's ensuring that the clean energy technology solution aligns with our values. And that requires a degree of transparency and allowing the U.S., the West superpower is our people and our private sector and our markets. If we inform the buyers of what's in their vehicles or in their clean energy technologies, then I think they would make the appropriate decisions. And there's an area where we can harness kind of ESG-related stakeholder activism to our benefit. I think people would turn away from clean energy technologies, as we've seen them do in solar panels, where human rights violations are at issue, or slavery. I think we need to increase degrees of transparency, and only then will we be able to level up.
Gentry, do you want to tackle this question?
I wish that were true. There's people who think that they're microchips in the vaccines, so I don't think that there's going to be a bunch of people who don't care what's in their Tesla, unfortunately. And I mean, I agree. I wonder, though, what civil-military fusion American style would look like. I think it's possible. The way we do innovation now in the DoD is just not working, not good. But
so can you mandate innovation from a DoD perspective, and what's that balance? DepSecDef Hicks yesterday or Friday,
love her.
I think she put out an Earth Day proclamation, for lack of a better term, that basically said, hey, everything we're doing moving forward, we have to think about energy efficiency from an operational standpoint. Obviously, DoD is by far the largest consumer of energy in the government, let alone, I think, probably just in the country, in the world.
I think they're the single largest buyer of oil.
Yeah, I mean, it costs a lot of money, takes a lot of gas to fly jets around the world and do it the way we do it, have the global reach that we have. So it's very aspirational for her to put forward a goal like that. Is it, from a strategy standpoint, from an operational effectiveness standpoint, you being a scholar of military strategy, is that a real thing that we can actually pursue, especially when we're thinking about how to maintain our advantages, right?
We could if we enacted wartime measures. America actually has a really good track record of getting technology into battle quickly, but only when we have decided we're at war.
We're seeing some of that kind of take place with how we're interacting with Ukraine, correct? I mean, is that what you're getting at? I mean,
yeah. Well, also just that's when the money flows, and also the risk tolerance lowers, so you can try things. You can we don't have a Manhattan Project for cyber right now. We don't have. I love Kath Hicks. I love Heidi Shue. If there are people in there right now who could do it, but they keep, look what they're doing. They keep going to Congress and keep asking for money in little increments, and then we start these stupid departments like the JAKE, where they talk about AI for 4 years, and they bring AI companies and AI experts in to talk to them, and we're talking to people who are not AI experts, so it makes no sense. And then 4 or 5 years later, they're like, oh yeah, well, we're gonna just quietly phase out that program, and they spent millions of dollars. It's priorities.
Sure. So, Frank, going back to something you said earlier about policy-induced energy transition. So can you expand on that and like tell us what you mean by that, and how it's the challenge with regard to, you said the technology isn't there. What does that all mean? Can we dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So this is a World Bank number. So before I was at the State Department, you mentioned I worked at BHP, which is the biggest mining company in the world. And the company, one of the things that we looked at was we're going to come out public for the first time with, this was around the time the Paris Climate Accord was going to happen. So we did an analysis. I mean, the company's been doing analysis for some time, but we're going to make it public for the first time. What if the Paris Climate Accord, what would that do to the portfolio? Because a lot of the activist shareholder groups were saying, don't invest in this company or that company, because it would be a stranded asset to invest in a mining company. And so what the company did is looked at all of the portfolio and imposed different carbon prices, and then realized that under various scenarios, the company would still double, because it would just reallocate the investment and have a greater return to whatever commodity was going to make more money in a climate-constrained world. And you've seen, so that kind of thinking has matured. And as kind of, but what we haven't seen is the investment in mining. What you've seen is the mining returns, but you haven't seen the investment to increase the amount of commodities that are being produced. And why does that matter? So you have different mining commodities that are important to the energy transition. Some of them are specialized, like lithium, cobalt, which go into batteries for your cars. And others are what they call cross-cutting, that are used in all kinds of technologies, like copper. It's probably the most cross-cutting electrification metal. You need it for everything. And as we talk about electrifying the world, that increases copper demand. According to the World Bank's number, we have mined about 550 million tons of copper in the last 5,000 years. To achieve the Paris and clean energy transition targets, we'll have to mine that much again in the next 25 years. We haven't discovered the mines, much less put them in production yet. So it takes, according to international energy agencies, IEA was one of my last things to encourage the IEA to put out a report looking at metals and commodities relative to the energy transition. They did a study. According to their number, it says it takes 17 years on average globally to go from discovery to production. Well, again, it hasn't been discovered yet, much less to have the time horizon to put into production. And now what we see is a socialist turn in historic copper-producing provinces like Peru, and Peru just suspended some of their activity. Chile just went left. Mexico just nationalized its lithium industry. So you see this constraint on investment. You see a change in governments that's creating a cloud over future investment, and the time horizon to get to where we need to go just doesn't seem to be there. So we can talk about climate ambition, but that's accelerating your demand and moving forward, and increasing the scale. But we have no corresponding. Everywhere I look, I see a headwind against the supply. So how are we going to realize any of this? And unless we address some of our own permitting issues, this is what I spoke about, having a heightened political will. And the administration is doing some things, but we need to really take on do the tough work. And this is something successive administrations have been loath to do, right? So how are we going to really get there? And mention oil is easy, transparent price discovery. Some of these clean energy transition things, the idea was it was like getting Haagen-Dazs ice cream with 0 calories, and it was going to taste the same, right? There will be some additional costs to the clean energy transition. Some of those we don't know what they are yet, but we have to. I think it's important to get serious about it if we're going to achieve these targets, which I think we need to do.
Sure. So unfortunately, Ron had to drop off, and I was hoping to ask him, but I'll put it to you also, both of you, and I want to thank him for taking the time that he did to participate. But so, what is incentivizing business, the private sector, to even delve into this challenging environment? I mean, what normally the profit motives are pretty clear, I would hope, before you jump into something like that. So what are the things that are driving the private sector to pursue what we see as what we need to drive after for energy independence, or advantage to continue to prosper and such? What are those things?
The availability of venture capital or capital, and then again, venture capitalists would rather invest in a subscription box or scooter company than something that will may have a longer return, or some innovation that might have a little bit longer return but will save the world. It's priorities.
Yeah, is from a policy standpoint, how do we incentivize, prioritize if we actually need to move in those directions? How do we get there better, or what'll help us move in that direction?
Well, yeah, I mean, capital is and you're right. I mean, the risk appetite. I mean, mining is literally a dirty business. You're digging stuff up. It's a huge amount of capital intensive. It's big stuff. It takes a long amount of time, and why invest in that if I can invest in an app and make a ton of money? And I don't even understand the valuations because there's no hard assets. But yeah, I mean, oil and gas. You drill a hole, you start producing. It's a mine. It's producing immediately. But to produce a copper mine or nickel or something, it's infrastructure, it's people, it's time, it's scale, it's hard. It's a very long lead time, and I think it's just a selection of capital.
There's a little trend right now for patient patriotic capital, but again, that's mostly a marketing ploy than people actually doing it. There's a few funds. There need to be more, and then again, who invests in those funds? It's that vicious, unvirtuous cycle of who are the funds that invest in funds looking for a quick return, of course, because that's what they provided or promised to their shareholders. So it's tricky.
You're saying that there is, to some extent, venture capitalists or venture capital being invested, that's being done so as or at least sold as they're doing it because they think it'll help move the country in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
There's bigger than just profits moving in that direction.
Yeah, there are mission aligned.
Sure.
Oh, our investors are.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, there's also, you see a policy frameworks. The direction is the issues with respect to China. Those were long building. I think what's happened with Ukraine has accelerated that trend tremendously. And that's also creating a new risk for other investment, where they otherwise would look at a supply chain linked to China in the clean energy space. Now they're saying, well, maybe that has a risk premium associated with that, whereas otherwise I would have done that deal. I'm involved in a mining metals fund and as an advisor, and the other issue is we're looking very, very seriously at ESG issues and how things are done, and as they should. And so that goes back to the valuation. How do we create a valuation where the relative increased costs to do the right thing, as they say, are integrated into your supply chain. So you differentiate a commodity. You can't just have a ton of copper. Isn't just a ton of copper. It shouldn't be that way. And there's been a realization that a solar panel built with slaves is forbidden. We shouldn't deal in that. And even though it may be cheaper and increase clean energy deployment, it's wrong. And I think that is an important point that we should kind of highlight and expand on.
Yeah, I think what was it last count? There's over 400 companies that had voluntarily pulled out of Russia, or in some way, shape, or form. They didn't do it necessarily because of sanctions, but which is unprecedented, I think. I mean, usually it's the sanctions are pushing them to do that. But so I think maybe we are in unique times. To that end, going back to Ukraine, I'd like to ask Gentry, what are some of the lessons that we're seeing or learning from a cybersecurity perspective on what's going on for energy infrastructure or otherwise in Ukraine right now, and with Russia involved? What does that look like? What are some of the things that we need to think about?
Securing telecom. So I know the grid is super trendy, like, oh, we're all worried about the grid. And after watching what's happening there, no. We need to look at our telecom supply chain and focus more on that.
So, can I ask you too? Have you had a chance to look at the issue with Chernobyl? Obviously, was a big deal, and Russia came in, took over the site, and had obviously some serious problems, not just keeping it up and running and preventing a disaster, but also apparently several of their soldiers who got sick because they just didn't deal with the situation correctly and for a variety of reasons. And I'll pose this to both of you. Is there a future really for increased U.S. nuclear power, right? That's something that comes up, and then you see a situation like this, and then Japan a couple of years ago, right, which they really had a hard time getting it under control. They did, but
nuclear power for power generation, you mean?
For power generation, right? Yeah. So what do we think about that for the United States as far as thinking? With regard to competitive advantage and where we need to go.
I think it's crucial, but not a Chernobyl kind of plant.
I hope not.
The new technology, and we've innovated. And some U.S. companies have innovated small modular reactor design, which are effectively fail-safe. They're safe, and by definition small and modular. So it doesn't have the enormous amount of capital required under a traditional nuclear power complex. You can build these and build them out over time to scale up, and I think that they're absolutely the future. When I was at the department, I looked at the issue. I mentioned work in the Balkans, and there's a nuclear plant called the Belene plant project in Bulgaria. And the Russians, Rosatom, were pushing for this thing to be built and move it forward. And I, my view was, we talk a lot about natural gas, Russian gas, but it shouldn't be focused on gas. It should be focused on Russian. And if it's Russian nuclear power or it's Russian gas and pipeline infrastructure, it's still creating a 50-year, 40-year-long dependency relationship. Because then the Russians continue to supply the nuclear fuel, and they're in your house, and so we shouldn't do that. So I was very pleased to see that the Bulgaria eventually turned away from that. And one of the, but you can't just say turn away from clean power and get nothing. We have to provide an alternative, and that's where we can come in with our superior technology, safer and cheaper. You have to give someone something, but nuclear power absolutely has to be a part of that story. And I would hope that countries like Germany would rethink their positions on nuclear power as they're rethinking things like defense spending.
Yeah, I don't understand why everyone doesn't look at France as the model. They're primarily nuclear run and no accidents. It's great.
So are they able? You talk about basically miniaturization, right, of a power supply.
It's a kind of a different technology, but
okay,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Are we going to be able to secure that in the same way that we're able to secure?
Well, no, because we hopefully, yes, hopefully, if people listen, yes, we could be baking security in, and you can make things, the way we built the internet and the way we built everything that connects to it, security was an afterthought because we just did not have the foresight at the time. It's like the leaders at the dawn of the aviation could not conceive of hypersonics, so we were thinking the same thing. We just couldn't see it. But going forward, and especially as the web evolves, Web 3.0 and all of that, security will be more baked in. And yeah, you absolutely can build a new nuclear reactor power generation that is secure.
So is that dialogue between the private industry that's developing these and the government happening in a robust enough fashion so that simultaneous, so that planning for security happens and is integrated into policy as it moves along?
In theory, I worked with Oak Ridge National Lab, and they have a computational security department right there next to the other directed energy endeavors that they have going on. So yeah, in theory.
Okay.
Yeah, this is one area where the Department of Energy has a considerable amount of experience, competency, and most of the DOE budget is focused on nuclear and nuclear non-proliferation. I mean, something like 85% of their budget is like nuclear non-pro. So this is something they actually are quite expert in, and I think their level of collaboration is considerable.
All right. I'm going to go back to our virtual audience, but first I'm going to see if there's anyone in the room that had a question before moving on. All right, we don't have any hands right now, but that option's available if you'd like. And so I'm going to go, we have a question from the Honorable Al Schaefer, who's been a really great supporter of this project and of the Institute. So I'm going to pose this to the team here. Nuclear energy produces 20% of U.S. electric power, yet most U.S. plants were built for a 40-year lifespan between 1970 and 1990. So we're continuing a theme here, right? Is a political baggage of nuclear power too much to overcome to use in the U.S.? Okay, we talked about France here. Nuclear is still viable in countries like France. So I'm repeating some here.
Me and Al were like...
Yeah, you guys are linked in the brain. So, all right, so we just actually hit this. Can you comment on what you see as the future of nuclear energy, both in the U.S. and internationally? So actually, this actually spurs... and I should have read this before I brought it up, but Al and you were obviously clicking on the same.
Where is he, by the way? Why is he not here?
He's a busy guy.
Okay.
So he always participates though, so in some form or fashion. So, but on the international front, and you talked about non-proliferation a little bit. What does that look like for us moving forward? With France obviously having been very successful. And you talked about collaboration earlier and how that can help us get to where we need to be. What does that look like?
Well, I think it creates a significant challenge because the laws governing our non-proliferation, including for civil nuclear cooperation, are dated, and they're not haven't kept pace with the technology that I just described. As a result of that, it binds our hands to not engage with countries that want to develop civil nuclear cooperation and have civil nuclear facilities in their countries. And it creates a vacuum, an opportunity for the Russians and in particular the Chinese to own that space. And it's a significant problem, particularly with MENA countries who want to be more, have a cleaner environment and all those things, and they're looking at nuclear power. And we have been constrained on what we can do. And it creates I could just say, a considerable degree of unnecessary tension with countries that we should have more favorable relationships with. And we're creating opportunities for the Chinese to come in.
So, you talked about technology development, and I mean, that technology is there already, right? So this is one of those opportunities really.
It's scaling up. I mean, I think they're about to deploying like the first commercial size kind of plants. But it's like now, when someone wants to develop a nuclear project, it's like a multi-year design build phase. Lots of, wherever there are, it's going to take many, many years. So we're at a perfect time to expand this kind of technology globally. But I think it's really, we need to have a rethink, and that takes some strong outreach to Congress, because they continue to have this expectation, which perhaps was, again, well-intentioned, but perhaps dated based on the technology.
So you mentioned Congress, and obviously that's where all the money flows from, and you have 535 different small businesses, all with a different focus, working on their agenda. Ron obviously helps, and I'm sure you had a hand in this, in the CHIPS Act getting across the finish line there. So How do you think that there's enough of an audience there to start digging in and focusing and understanding on first a strategy, but focusing on looking at our portfolio and getting to a better place from a policy standpoint, and putting money against it to get to where we need to be from a competitive standpoint.
Congress, the problem with them is they don't play well with others because they're the way it's set up. They're there to, represent their state. So, so many Congress people, while they're good, high integrity people, will do the wrong thing because it doesn't benefit their state. So it's no, I would not look to them for any kind of coherence on doing the right thing.
What do you think, Frank?
Yeah, I think that's time immemorial, right? You got to bring home the bacon. All politics are local. Pick another cheeky thing to say. I think that regardless of whether, in terms of the clean energy space, whether someone's looking at the reason why we need to do that is to address climate change, or we need to do it because we have to combat China. It kind of gets you to the same method, regardless of what your end result is, and that is we have to kind of reshore this industry and create a technology manufacturing back to America, or at least within our allied sphere. And so I do think that there's some room to work. Now, where things like demonstration labs, and yes, I mean, that comes back to, building things in your home state or what have you. But I do think at a high level, there's an understanding of how we're going to have to do this. I think I'm more concerned about the operationalizing than R&D and things like that. Because we don't have these plants. So do we really need to study it again?
I agree, 1,000%, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we need to just get after it. And so how do we mobilize the private sector to do that? How do we empower them to do that and de-risk projects? And, I really think that this is where it gets really, really sticky, because it's going to be upsetting Congress, and it's going to have some kind of new sighting of projects and streamlining. Some people love that word, some people think they hate it, but we have to address it.
And you're so 100% right on. We have these federally funded research labs, which are just a wealth of commercialized or near R&D stuff that could be commercialized, but there's the valley of death. There's the tech transition process is so woefully broken in this country. And again, who funds that sort of thing? Because sometimes these deep tech projects that will increase American resilience or underline our power projection are not the sexy things that VCs want to. It's just like, where does the money come from? Now, if we enacted wartime powers, then there would be money flowing into those sort of things. So that's the last time we did that was, I just think of other big expensive projects that got funded.
So do you think the imperative, or essentially what we're learning here from the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Nord Stream pipeline and the leverage that Russia has over Europe and opportunities and vulnerabilities to that end, do you think that is enough of an imperative to drive some of the action that you're talking about? Because we obviously have to understand that, implications here from a domestic energy standpoint, but what are we learning from that, if at all? Is that a motivator?
It should be. I feel like it's going over everyone's head, and no, we're not at war. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so every new government comes into power and kind of comes in with their organizing principle. And the former administration, it was, and I'm thinking not about domestic areas, but foreign policy areas. security was like number 1, 2, and 3. And that was the lens through which we looked at every decision making. And that meant that other equities, maybe people felt that they were not given the prominence that they deserved. But that's what happened. This administration, they came into office, and climate change was the organizing principle of government. Now, there's an inherent challenge when you overlay the security dimension with climate change, because whereas security was the former administration's organizing principle, and the U.S. had more energy than anybody, then that was it increased our degree of latitude. By contrast, climate change being the organizing principle of government, this administration, and the world's superpower of emissions is our greatest adversary. And we're not holding the leverage, they are. And we're expecting to achieve our outcome. We're expecting our adversary to take actions that we'd like them to take. So it creates a real problem.
But without a comprehensive coercion strategy. It's just sort of some uncoordinated lines of effort. We're not actually... An
expectation that they'll see the light, right? And road to Damascus.
Yeah, and they don't work that way.
No, they don't. And they're not succumbing to public pressure and that kind of thing. So where do we go from here? So the question is, does Ukraine change that? And I think I'm thinking about what's the after Ukraine situation look like, sure, and whether we're going to remember it, and what does that look like? Are we going to? I mean, I don't think I think that not having slave labor in a supply chain should be a given. Some people are concerned about the tariffs and the prohibitions against human rights tainted clean energy technologies because they're although that's important, they don't want to slow down climate progress. I think that's completely violative of the foundations of the republic. And so I think we need to come back to those founding principles. And my hope is that Ukraine will have a bigger understanding of kind of traditional Western values, and that we will create an architecture that it's not a decoupling because we don't like a particular country, but it's creation of markets that pre-select what's okay and what's not. And that's kind of that's what I'm doing some work at, kind of working toward that end, and I'm very hopeful that's because we're not going to. Like Gentry was talking about in terms of money and things, we're not going to be able to mobilize money like China, right? And we shouldn't.
Because we're a free market. And
that's
we
right.
Like it that way.
That's exactly right. But what we like lead with our values. Are our values a feature or a bug? And I think we should use this moment of reasonable Western solidarity to kind of advance those principles.
So this is a theme that we keep coming back to over the Global Competition Project is understanding or revisiting where we're at as a country with regard to our values and how we reconcile that with how we need to address the world in a substantive way to make sure that yes, we could still lead, we could still ensure our security and prosperity, but also do it given the global interdependencies that we have and all that. So it's interesting that it continues to be brought up on its own again. With that said, I'm going to go back over to Dr. Locklear and see if we have some other questions online that are waiting. Awesome.
Question from Mr. Trevor Hufford. He asks, our problems are often described as engineering or science problems. What are we really up against here? Is it a matter of engineers just wrestling with it long enough? Or is there some breakthrough we should be investing to improve our energy portfolio?
Thanks, Trevor. Trevor's one of our sharp young researchers here at the Institute.
Okay.
So.
I think it's prioritization. Sorry, we have the best universities and the smartest people in the world here, and the smartest, infrastructure in terms of our national labs. I don't think there's anything we can't figure out.
I think that's right. I go back to the political will and operationalizing some of this. I mean, we're really serious. And I relatively recent example. The state of Massachusetts has some ambitious climate targets. They have some wonky policies, but we'll put those aside. But they have some ambitious climate targets. They put together and funded a transmission line to wheel power from Quebec, hydropower, carbon-free hydro, build a transmission line through Western Maine to go into Massachusetts. There's something like 3/4 of all of the trees were already cut down. The siting was already moving underway, and it had been pre-approved some time ago. Some Maine environmental groups sued, blocked the construction of this project, and the Maine groups said, environmental groups, effectively said that yes, this would help the planet, this power, but we shouldn't impose environmental harm kind of in our backyard to achieve, climate progress or something along those lines. This is one transmission line. How are we going to really do this? To electrify a third of the motor fleet in America would completely destroy the electric grid today. It would just wipe it out. So how are we going to really do that? And this goes back to political will. I don't think, as Gentry said, we got the smartest people and innovation and all of that. That's easy. It's a matter of the political will, and someone's going to get offended. And how do we address their concerns, but do it in a way that allows the country's objectives to advance? I don't know how to do it.
So one of the ways, obviously, that new policies really spread across the country is by the states taking leadership one by one, right? And soon you have a domino effect. In California tends to be, leading or has led in a lot of ways on this front. Cleaner, renewable energy. We talked about the recyclables and the 7 different bins that Ron was talking about struggling with and such. I think Governor Newsom out there just recently said, and don't quote me on this, I think these are the right details, but after 2035, there are no more internal combustion engines that are going to be allowed to be sold, new ones in the state. So, and California's, because it's its size and economy and all that kind of stuff, has led the country on things like this, not necessarily just from an energy standpoint, but from other things too. Is that something that is realistic for us, for our economy, for the technology that's there, and from a policy standpoint? You talk about bold, leadership on a policy standpoint. Is that tenable?
Yeah, I hope so. I think so. I think that is a good model. I don't really know enough. I'm saying this as I'm good friends with a climate officer of California. I should know more about this. But yeah.
Put you on the spot here.
I know, so. Sorry. Hi, Matt. No, it should, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I take a different view. I think, politicians say lots of things and it's a popular position, I'm sure, in California by and large. But I go back to where are those going to come from? I mean, California just was moving forward with some positions on increasing their renewables, reduced net zero targets in that, and they just were about to buy one of the biggest grid scale battery projects in America, and all of that just got delayed because CATL, the Chinese battery provider, decided to, because they were concerned about their own reputational risk for lithium-ion battery storage suite options, there were some fires, some Porsches burned in the ocean forever. When these fires start, you can't pull the water. It's a chemical fire. It's very, very bad and burns very hot. So CATL has delayed the shipment because they wanted to improve their own risk management, and so only send it through one port. And you saw Ron's picture of the ports, right? So the delivery of this battery, which is something like 600 megawatts, huge system, ain't going to happen. So where is this going to come from? And how is it going to come from? And I generally don't, China was able to stimulate demand for electric vehicles in many ways, subsidizing the heck out of it, but also a course of models to force electric vehicle penetration. To get a license plate in Beijing, you either choose you don't have to buy an electric car, but you just won't. If you buy an internal combustion engine, you just won't get a license plate. You just can't drive it. So I tend not to be a big fan of coercive capitalism.
Sure. All right. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Go ahead, Tim.
So you mentioned that the largest emitter in terms of trying to clean up climate change also just happens to be our geopolitical adversary at the moment. But say what we will about China, one of the things they are pretty good at is taking the long view. So what is their estimation for why climate change is not going to be a problem for them? If the US collapses tomorrow and China is the global hegemon, the world is still going to end if they don't take corrective action, and then they're going to be the global hegemon of a giant puddle with no people on it. So are they unconvinced about the realities of climate change? Do they think they have a technological solution in their back pocket? What is your view of China's view of how they're going to get out of this pickle?
I have no idea. That's a great question, though.
It is a great question. It's an important one, and thank you for raising it, because what you're speaking really to is motivation for a clean energy transition. Like what U.S. is I don't own a Tesla, but I've been in them. They're amazing. Performance is spectacular. It's a great product. But I think a considerable amount of the call for cleaner forms of energy in the United States is partially a performance, but also to mitigate against climate change. And so we're making a considerable effort on to do that. That's our motivation. China's motivation to address to control the commanding heights of the clean energy economy is not focused on outcomes, the outcome being to reduce emissions. It's focused on control. China has for many years chafed at relying on the U.S. naval protectorate of naval sea lanes for oil transit. They developed an entire infrastructure to own the new economy and control that. They have a playbook that they've repeatedly deployed. Something like 80% of all solar panels are coming from China. The U.S. was in the lead of solar panel technology and manufacturing. And what happened? What happened was, particularly Germany adopted some policies to green their economy. China, at the same time, was moving forward with state policies, some state industrial policies to invest in strategic industries. And they created an overcapacity in China, and one of those was in solar technology. Then all of a sudden, Germany decides to create a market that they couldn't fill. And China effectively started dumping solar panels into Germany. And now they're the dominant solar panel company in the world. The West is pursuing similar policies when it comes to electric vehicles penetration. And China has developed an entire soup to nuts, mine mouth to manufacturing supply chain to control the entirety of that vertical integration. And now they're the dominant producer of these technologies. So the West is creating markets based on an environmental outcome, and China is creating an industrial policy to control that outcome. Why do I say it's unrelated to environmental outcomes and its security? Because they continue to increase their emissions. They continue to build coal plants, and they don't necessarily need to. So it's also a point of leverage for them, because we in the West are asking China, like, we cannot achieve our ambitions, our climate targets, unless China moderates its behavior in some way. They've been demonstrated no willingness to do that, and Special Climate Envoy Kerry has multiple times sought China to compartmentalize that relationship. Let's work on the areas where we can work on together. And the Chinese unfortunately continue to rebuff them in the United States and Europe and say, no, they look at all matters together. You can't separate issues. So I don't know where they go from there, but I think it's important to distinguish the motivations for why China is pursuing climate or clean energy transition technologies, and why the U.S. or the West are.
Any other questions from the? Got one from Melissa over here.
Hi. So you've touched on innovation, its importance kind of across the board. But I was wondering, when we think of innovation, which is kind of a loaded term in general, what are really the drivers for that, both from the commercial perspective as well as the government perspective? When we think of the energy sector, and kind of what are, I guess, the conditions that we need to be, quote unquote, successful within this? And then further, how do we define what we think of as success when it comes to the U.S. energy portfolio?
Like who's deciding, what success is? That's a good question. I don't know. So our civilian sector is the crown jewel of innovate. It's like America's number one priority that we will all agree on, is that America is the land where anybody can do anything if you work hard enough. Like, that's our principle the hill that we will all die on. It's for me, it always goes back to funding, but that's probably just because I'm a founder who's always worrying about funding.
Yeah, I think it's I would say public adoption for some of this stuff. I mean, we talk a lot about electric vehicles, but they're still $100,000. Most people don't drive a $100,000 vehicle. So when is this going to be? When is electric car no longer going to be considered a luxury good? When is there going to be a $25,000 electric car? And that requires there to be a different kind of technology to go into that battery, because the battery for an electric car that goes, as far as a Tesla goes, it's cost prohibitive. You can't get there for $25,000. So there has to be an acceptability of that technology. And that speaks to the public. And I don't know who's going to produce that right now. China's producing them. And that's why one of the reasons why they have a higher penetration rate by far, because they've made the electric vehicle accessible to most people. I mean, I don't need to drive 250 miles most of the time, very rarely. But would I purchase a car that can only drive 100 miles on a charge? I don't know. Maybe if it's $25,000, I would. But that's a different kind of technology, and so I mean, where's that public acceptability to the scaling and the deployment of the technology? And once there's a confidence level that there will be that market, I'm sure that technology will be scaled up to meet the market. But I don't know, chicken or egg. I don't know how to get there.
So to kind of follow on with that question, and this is just bigger strategy kind of thoughts. Hopefully, if we did have to really think about and choose and prioritize, at least on the government side, but the industry too obviously follows policy and vice versa. Based on where we're at with innovation and technology, where should the U.S. Focus, right, from a renewable standpoint? What's the most promising? I mean, solar's been around for a long time, right? The technology, from what I understand, has gotten better, but it still has a ways to go. Wind has, issues. There's promise there too. And you go down the line. Hydro has been successful. So what? And again, revisiting nuclear energy. What is that? What should that look like? From a priority standpoint.
Yeah, and hydrogen. This is not my area of expertise, except. Yeah, no, I'm just nuclear. Sorry.
No, and to be able to secure that, right?
Yeah, totally. But
So,
things
huge.
have changed so much since the Greenpeace saved the whales, and closed the nuclear plant days. It's totally different now. So, yeah.
Frank, how about you? What do you?
Well, America's a big place. And, you go to Europe, you drive across the country in an afternoon. So you can't do that really in America. And we have that diversity has different elements which have different kinds of renewable potential endowment. And so it's not going to be a one size kind of fit all solution set. I think driving down, continuing the innovation, I think what the other thing that you're seeing is the entire regulatory system in the United States. It's fractured, and it's in order in certain states they're regulated by public utility commissions,
Right.
which are political bodies, which allow for a monopoly of energy provider to exist. I don't know if that's good or bad. I tend to think monopolies stymie innovation and acceptance of new technology penetration. So maybe that's a place to start. I don't necessarily think that the federal government should be the one to dictate that, because the federal government often does things crudely and badly and
Slowly, way too slowly.
Yeah, way too slowly, and it becomes litigious. I mean, as I mentioned before, the shale revolution occurred because it wasn't the federal government involved. If the federal government was involved, we should be talking about it. I go back to my earlier comments about let's create the conditions for innovation to occur and for public acceptance to give it a go. But we're going to have to change the whole regulatory structure. These renewable technologies are no longer they're not niche, right? So that's the other thing is I think there should kind of the public and politicians, political class leadership. We ought not talk about them like they're special. They're mainstream, right? And so, they're just a different way of producing energy, and sometimes it can be a lot cheaper and better. Sometimes, depending on where you are, not so much. But you can change your solution set based on where you are, and you could have better alternatives. But you have to have the flexibility to do it. And I think look, government necessarily should be a latent indicator. Government should follow the private sector and innovators, and that's as it should be. It's just our government seems to be far more latent than it should. So, can we do something that empowers that? And some of that is this is state level stuff, and county level, some of that NIMBYism was going to come
Right,
into play.
sure, yep. So moving forward, Gentry, so we've only got a couple more minutes here, but what I'd like to ask you from a cybersecurity standpoint, looking at our grid, looking at what we need to do, what are if you had to pick three things, that we could do immediately, or things that are on the near horizon, that'll help us make sure that as money flows in, as investment flows in from the government side, from the R&D side, what can we do to make sure that what we do build, what we do invest in, is secure from a security standpoint, from your expertise?
Yeah, and I would argue to do exactly what you're asking me to do, exactly opposite of what you're asking me to do,
Okay.
and not look at the operational level and look at things from a higher strategic level.
Okay.
And say, what is it that we want? Do we want nation states constantly lobbying attacks, constant aggression on civilian or investor-owned critical infrastructure? No. Okay. Well, then how do we stop that? Because they don't attack our airports nonstop. They do, but they don't attack us in other warfighting domains. Mm-hmm. So, what's the deterrent strategy to stop this? And then, if it's not an active theater, you'll see less crime, and it'll. What do we want to do? What do we want for our end state, and then make the priorities after that.
So if you had to pick an incentive, is it because that, energy use is so prolific that we we need it for everything, right? Mm-hmm. For our quality of life, is that why it's so, such a target? Is that from?
Is that why they go after it?
Yeah.
Well, and it's easy because they have their own system, so they can look at theirs and know that ours work the same way. Mm-hmm. Telecom is the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's actually not the number one target. Healthcare is. So yeah, I know. I think it's really funny. Everyone thinks, oh, Chinese medicine is so much better. No. Because they are stealing all of our, they're the number one stealing all of our biomedical and healthcare information. It's just it's the best way to literally weaken America is to attack our energy.
Let me ask you, I'm going to take your job for you.
Yes, sir. Please.
Gentry, something I was musing about, because all this question about, NATO, non-NATO, and Ukraine, and, can we send jets? But I was thinking about it, what if there were an attack on a NATO country? I just saw that Russia stopped exporting gas to Poland, by the way. What if Russia were to impose like a severe cyber attack on Poland, such that it debilitates the economy in a way that World War II bombing of Dresden factories, right? You're taking out of their capital equipment to wage war. What if they had made that level of an attack and it was very clearly Russian? And Poland asserted Article 5 because of a cyber attack. What's your thought on the invocation of that and that being?
We're trying.
Are we in it?
No, because there hasn't been catastrophic damage. So that's the way I work with NATO Supreme Allied Command transformation on this very product is where is the line?
Right. I was.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the next thing. So they're talking about. It's no longer boots on the ground. It's the cyber domain. That's going to be someone's going to assert it. It's just when is it sufficient pain point to make that call?
Well, but it's not going to be a catastrophic shock and awe attack.
Right.
Those are temporary. You can fix it. You can take the grid out and then fix it a couple days later. It's the slow degradation. It's the salami slicing away. It's the little tiny my internet goes out once a week or once a month because it's taken down for a few hours, and then it's twice a week, and then it's 3 times a week, and then now everything's constantly slow. That's what we're worried about. That's the real danger. That's what they're really good at, and it's easier to effectuate.
Yeah.
And it's salami tactics. It's a tried and true military tactics been used since the ancients, and it adapts really well to the cyber domain.
Do we have the authorities to effectively deal with that?
Nope. Oh, authorities? Yeah, we have the authorities for everything.
Are we exercising?
We don't. No, we don't have the capacity.
I think the question I would have to follow that up is,
Tim, can you give him the mic?
it's loud enough. I'm pretty sure everybody can hear me. How do we empower U.S. agencies in such a way that they can respond effectively to both domestic and international cyber attacks.
Mhm.
Who is that agency? I know who I think it is. In your opinion, who is that agency and what policies would make them more effective than they will?
So it's not a policy thing. Cyber Command is our boots on the ground or boots in cyberspace force, but they only defend government.
What is CISA's role?
CISA is just a coordinator.
So
They're the liaison between.
CISA doesn't have a role in protecting the cyber infrastructure of both civilian agencies and let's say commercial energy markets in the United States.
They protect them by telling them shields up.
So right. So do they need more authority and capabilities within that agency in order to affect change?
The civilian sector does not want anything that CISA has to give them. But that's 80% of the attack surface is in the civilian sector.
So we see it also in the civilian agency market. I'm curious, when CISA says, hey, we're here to support you, we're here to protect your networks as civilian agencies from a CDM perspective, for example, and those agencies say, no, thank you, where does the authority really lie? And why does it lie with CISA?
Yeah, there's nobody protecting the civilian infrastructure companies. They're on the front line of a live armed conflict against formidable adversaries. They have no strategy, no inadequate weapons and unevenly distributed weapons, and no cohesion, no intelligence, and no intelligence sharing between them. But that's why I started my company, is to fix that. So that's what we do. We fix that. CISA doesn't have a responsive force. Our only responsive force is Cyber Command. It's 7,000 people. It's small. They're Homeland Security, and to me, this is a national security issue. To me, this is a military issue. CISA is more for terrorism and crime, and when it's state on state, when it's military on civilian, to me, that's a DoD thing. It's a good question, a good argument. We had that a couple of months ago, but yeah, to me, this is a military affair. There are crimes to the kids that need to be looked at as well, and the deterrent for crime is different than the deterrent for war and battle. So it's, maybe that's CISA's role.
Isn't CISA chartered with standardizing the federal civilian agency cybersecurity infrastructure?
Yep.
But they don't have the authority to do it. They've just been chartered to do it.
Well,
can we give them the authority to do it? Does that help them? Will it make us safer from a civilian agency perspective? There are 45 civilian agencies.
But
they're not protected by Cyber Command.
No, they are. Well, Cyber Command is the offensive aspect of it. So, and then there's DISA, which is monitoring the networks and monitoring the defense part of it, the boring, pure cybersecurity part of it. I don't know that CISA needs more authorities. I would like to see our cyber forces, the size of it, 10x. I would like to see them working hand in hand with the civilian sector. I would like our financial institutions and all the companies that are responsible for, the critical societal functions that we all use every day, not be this vulnerable. Yeah.
So clearly, you should have been asking the questions, because that was a great discussion. Yeah, no, that was perfect. Thank you.
Do you work at CISA?
So I have to provide 30 seconds here for each of you to just what's your one takeaway here for the discussion today that we want to make sure that we walk away with. Frank, I'll start with you.
The transition to cleaner forms of energy is not reducing our security concerns; it's increasing them. We have the absolute means to retake our leadership in that realm. We have to have a commensurate response of political will to achieve it. I'm hopeful, and I know that there are well-intentioned investors, community, companies who are similarly aligned to achieve that mission. But it's going to take some higher degree of political will and some hard work. But I think we can get there.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being or for joining us for the panel. And Gentry, what's the one takeaway, the big thing that we should make sure that we can make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction as far as competitive advantage as a country?
Yeah, if we want energy to be our main competitive advantage, the main cornerstone in our arsenal of diamond institutions and actors, then update. We need to modernize, and of course security has to be baked in.
Yeah,
period.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you also. Thank you, General Gray, for
I think very good. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for a very interesting discussion. I think from the standpoint of a societal type competition, there are a lot of elements out there in the international community, China and some of the other countries where they don't do so well. And we ought to clearly understand that, and we ought to map a strategy to take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of problems in China that are right beneath all the discussion, and we ought to know about that. We spend too much time talking about how great they are, and not enough time thinking about some of their weaknesses.
Yeah, and how we can use those weaknesses against them, because that's all they do. They sit and think about our weaknesses and how they can use them against us.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And I want to thank the Potomac Institute staff. It takes a lot of folks to make this a success, and especially to Dr. Locklear over there, who did a lot on the substantive side of teeing up our discussion. So thank you. To the team, be on the lookout for our next event, which is tentatively scheduled for May 25th. And we'll take a look back at what we've explored, kind of take a look at the highlights and look forward, and how should we take what we learned and turn them into recommendations for actually substantive, action to blaze a good productive path forward. So thanks again for being with us today, both online and in person, and we'll see you next time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Just remember all the skyscrapers in the Shanghai area were built by the Japanese.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, sir, very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Jennifer, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Really good.
Fun.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.